All right, let's do this. You ready? G'day ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Draw with Jazza. I'm Jazza, and today I'm going to be doing a video on composition. Now, the elements of this video and the images actually in particular have been created for the 21 Draw book, which is on the fundamentals of art, and you can check it out with the link in the description. And this is a book that I and many other really awesome artists have contributed to, covering fundamental basics of drawing and various principles of illustration. And today I'm going to be covering composition. And we're going to be talking about a few things that you can keep in mind to make your images pop, or just to have a sense of balance, or know how to best communicate what your story is in the image, or how to guide the viewer's eye in a way that's going to be constructive and easy for them to understand and interpret. So the first thing I want to talk about is something you may have seen around or heard of, and that is the rule of thirds. And essentially the idea is that in many well-composed images, or images that have an aesthetically pleasing nature about them, if you break it down and divide the image into 9 pieces, essentially having 2 vertical and 2 horizontal divisions evenly along the image, we divide the piece up into thirds horizontally and thirds vertically. Now, the rule of thirds is a method that essentially means that most of the points of interest or divisions of the aesthetic of an image take place along the converging points of these lines. So for example, with this character in the foreground here, rather than being placed in the middle of the image, even though he's the focus of the image, he's shifted along to the right, where he's balanced more along this line, the right line in the rule of thirds example, and his eye line is placed at the converging between the right line and the top line. This is a common thing that happens in the rule of thirds, where the eye line of a character is placed either at this point, this point, this point, or this point, most often in the top 2. You'll also notice that with the background, even this food barn thing is divided into 2 segments. We have this side panel of the building, which takes up the middle third, and then we have the other section of the building, which takes up the other section. And so the image is essentially divided into 3 horizontally, and then we have points of interest vertically as well, with the eye line and the food barn sign taking place up the top there, and then his hand sort of in that bottom right area. Now with this example here, set in space with an American flag on some unknown planet, again this American flag is set right along this middle left line in the rule of thirds, and this planet is in the top right panel, and the entire horizon lines up with this lower line and below. Now this is a common thing as well, that one of these horizontal lines is picked as the horizon for the piece, and often it's the lower one, so that there's more of a sense of place in the top half of the image. And then our final example here, we have a similar thing. We have a very foreground based character who takes place mostly in the left part of the image. Again, keeping in mind with the rule of thirds, our eyes read from top left to bottom right. So we're actually going to see this corner first, which is why in the first example, the thing that we notice, aside from the fact that there's a character, is this. We read the food barn thing pretty early on when viewing the image. So in this example, we see this character pretty quickly, but then other things are placed along these intersecting points. So the eye, again, is in that primary place for an eye line. The moon is behind that intersecting point there. It's all pretty rough. You don't need to exactly stick to these lines as guides when using the rule of thirds. It's just good to use as a rough guide when dividing your image or composing something, to know roughly maybe where to put a horizon, or where to place a character that's going to feel aesthetically pleasing. So there are a few examples of the rule of thirds. Our next principle that we're going to talk about is background, midground, and foreground. Now, when you create an image, you really want to make sure that there's a sense of depth, and to do this, you can use background, midground, and foreground elements to make your image feel rich and deep and full. So in this example, we start off with the foreground. Often, if the foreground isn't a feature of focus in the image, it can be made darker to feel like we're looking past it, and it's sort of a bit in shadow. It's a little bit unhighlighted in the whole scope of the image. And then we have our midground. Now this alone could work quite well as an image, but it starts to feel a bit sparse, and there's no real sense of scale, which is where the background comes in. The background in the far back essentially allows us to give something a real position in the world. So for example, we have these large mountains, so we can tell that we're in a bit of an adventurous area in the wilderness. There's a comparative sense of scale because we can see how big these mountains are. We must get a sense for how distant they are, and also because everything's quite light, it means that they're pushed far back in the environment. Now usually the action takes place in an image in the midground or foreground. It's not very often that there'll be much happening in the background, but the background is very useful to create that sense of place and establishing what is happening and where it is. The next thing I want to talk about in regards to composition is contrast. Now, when you see this image, the first thing that you see is this character here, obviously because there's this great sense of light and dark in this image that immediately draws our eye to this area of the image, and then from there we start to notice the details and the lighting and the flame that's reflecting on his body and the pose that he's making, the direction he's walking in, and then it's after that that we notice this grumpy troll-like character in the corner of the image that is fairly unnoticeable. Now this is intentional, of course, because we don't want the viewer to see this image and immediately feel threatened. We want that to become apparent as the image is stared at more and more. So by using something like contrast, by having a very bright area that's opposing this really dark area that we're sort of screening out here, we're training the eye of the viewers to look in a specific direction and linger longer than they would normally if all the lighting in the image was completely balanced and we could see everything equally. Now, contrast doesn't necessarily only apply to light and dark. It can apply to color and texture and scale, but light and dark is one of the most easy to demonstrate aspects of contrast. But contrast itself is extremely useful as a principle of composition in guiding the viewer's eye and helping guide their emotions and expectations throughout the image. Next, I want to talk about detail. Now, the funny thing about detail is, especially to beginning artists, detail feels like the be-all and end-all. The more detailed you can make an image, the better the image, but that's not necessarily true. The end goal of your job as a storyteller, and that's what you are when you create illustrations or animation or whatever, is to be clear and communicate exactly what needs to be communicated. And if there's a lot to communicate, then you might need a lot of detail, but a lot of the time you're actually just trying to say something perhaps simple or very quickly. So in this example on the left here, there's a lot more detail in this area here than there is in the rest of the image. In fact, if you zoom in here, you can see that the attention to detail and shading is pretty rough there, but then when you get up here into the hair and into the face, obviously there's a lot more line work, a lot more intricacy and detail going on. There's more shading and more refinement. And the result is when the piece is seen as a whole for the first time, the eye is going to rest there. A lot easier than searching through the whole image. We know where the important stuff is because the detail is there and the rest is a lot softer. And this can actually often be much more pleasing to look at because our eye doesn't feel confused as to things that aren't important. We're looking really at what is telling the story. To further demonstrate this, I have an example of a gladiator match here with a man fighting an opponent. Now, there is a lot happening in this image. There's a stadium in the background with a crowd, an arena. There's an enemy in the foreground, and then there's a character in the midground who might be the protagonist, he might be the enemy. Now, a technique that you can use which is really useful and can look really nice is something called depth of field. This is essentially where everything that isn't in complete focus is shifted out slightly or made slightly blurry so that we know exactly what we're looking at. And this is obviously much easier to do in digital programs. It's really a breeze. For example, in Photoshop, I can just go up to here to Gaussian blur, and just like that, I can add a blur to the background, the stadium, and you can still see that it's a stadium, but it's much softer and really sort of blurred out so that we can really see the crisp edges of this character instead of being too distracted by all the detail in the arena. Now, if we really wanted the viewer to focus only on that character, we could even add a blur to this character in the foreground, just to the point where we can just make out what it is, that it's an arm holding a sword, but really the eye, when it looks at this image, is immediately pulled into one area, and that is right here. So all of a sudden, by using this depth of field technique, we can zone out a whole bunch of the detail without necessarily losing the impact that it has when we initially created it. And this is a technique that's used in cinematography to really help add punch to the impact of what the focus in the image is. The last principle of composition I want to talk about is symmetry and asymmetry. Symmetry is basically where everything is really balanced and even in the image. For example, here, if you cut the image in half and mirrored it, you would see that from left to right, it's almost identical, except for a few minor changes, of course. But the general gist of the image is really center balanced and even. And this can be used to create a sense of predictability, a feeling of mundaneness. It can also convey harmony or structure. Asymmetry is the opposite. It's where we unbalance things. It's where we make something feel uneven or unequal from left to right or on a weird angle. And the reason asymmetry can be useful is we can really instill a sense of discomfort in our viewers, even to the point where you can take a symmetrical panel and tilt it, like so. And all of a sudden, even the panel itself is making people feel a little on edge because there's something not quite right about it. It's out of balance, it's not neat. So in viewing this, we have a harsh upwards angle, we have a line in the background that's a very strong line indicating the angle of the room, which is very off from a flat horizon. And then the panel itself being turned also adds to that sense of asymmetry. So that's my little breakdown video of 5 different elements of composition that you can use when creating your images and illustrations and animations. I hope you enjoyed it, and make sure to check out the 21 Draw book for more on this. And there's another chapter I did on perspective, and there's a whole bunch from other amazing artists that you should check out. The link is in the description. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining, ladies and gentlemen, and until next time, I'll see you later.
Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe to my channel for new content every week. If you want to support my work and get some goodies for yourself, head over to my store for archives, ebooks, digital brushes, video courses, and more. If you enjoyed this video, here's a link to another video you might like from this channel. And if you want even more, make sure to check out all my behind the scenes action on my vlog channel, Daily Jazza. Draw with Jazza is proudly sponsored by Adobe. Join the Creative Cloud today and get loads of incredible creative tools like Photoshop, Animate, Premiere Pro, and other apps for your computer or mobile device. That's it for now. Thanks for joining the arty party, and until next time, I'll see you later.